The morning is already in motion before you decide how to meet it. A chair is nudged back into place without thought, wood scraping softly against the floor. Light stretches across the room where the curtain was left half open overnight. Somewhere nearby, water runs and stops. A phone vibrates once against a hard surface, then settles into silence. Nothing significant has happened yet, and still the day has begun asking for something. The body answers before the mind assembles a reason. You straighten, not abruptly, just enough to feel balanced. Shoulders ease back. The weight in your stance redistributes. Breath settles lower, slower. It is a small adjustment, almost invisible, but it changes how the room feels. How you feel standing inside it. Life does not arrive gently. It does not pause to be understood. It comes already carrying weight. Tasks left unfinished. Responsibilities that did not disappear overnight. Conversations that will need to be reopened. The quiet awareness of things avoided, postponed, or handled only halfway. You feel that weight before you name it, before you decide what to do about it. The question is not whether it exists. The question is how you will hold yourself beneath it. There is a posture that invites collapse. Head angled slightly downward. Chest drawn inward. Movement shortened, as if taking up less space might reduce what is asked of you. It feels protective, almost reasonable, especially when uncertainty is high. And then there is another posture, less dramatic and more deliberate, where the body signals readiness instead of retreat. Not confidence exactly. Something older. A willingness to remain upright when pressure begins to lean in. Long before language, living things learned to read posture. Strength and vulnerability were communicated through stance, through movement, through how much ground was claimed or surrendered. That language never vanished. It still operates beneath conversation, beneath credentials, beneath intention. You can feel it in how rooms respond to certain people. In how attention gathers or drifts without anyone deciding that it should. When you stand upright, the world does not become kind. It becomes clearer. You stop advertising fragility to forces that do not negotiate. Chaos does not argue. It presses. It leans into whatever gives way most easily. And whatever bends without resistance tends to carry more than its share. This is not about dominance. It is about orientation. About aligning yourself so effort can travel cleanly from intention into action. A spine held straight carries weight more efficiently. A life approached deliberately does the same. Energy stops leaking through hesitation and apology. Movement becomes simpler, even when it remains difficult. Responsibility enters here quietly, without announcement. Not as a moral demand. Not as inspiration. As necessity. If you do not organize what you cannot control will organize it for you. Usually clumsily. Often painfully. Order does not erase chaos. It creates small regions where chaos does less damage. The day continues around you, indifferent to your internal negotiations. Traffic thickens somewhere beyond the walls. Messages accumulate. Schedules tighten. None of it is dramatic. All of it is real. And in the middle of it, a choice repeats itself in subtle forms. Whether to meet what is coming with structure, or to let it pile up unchecked. You attend to the next small thing. One object returned to where it belongs. One task acknowledged instead of postponed. One decision made consciously rather than by default. Order does not arrive as a finished state. It appears briefly wherever attention is applied honestly, then recedes again if it is not maintained. This does not guarantee safety. It does not promise fairness. It does something quieter and more reliable. It creates a position from which life can be faced without unnecessary weakness. From which mistakes can be corrected before they multiply. From which effort has somewhere to land. By the time you step forward into the rest of the day, the choice has already been made. Not loudly. Not heroically. But with enough intention to matter. The posture holds. The direction is set. And for now, that is sufficient. The day does not adjust itself to reward your posture. It moves the way it always does, unevenly and without consultation. Something takes longer than expected. A plan shifts at the last moment. A message arrives carrying a tone you did not anticipate. None of it rises to the level of crisis, but together it creates a steady pressure that asks how you will respond once things stop lining up neatly. This is where comparison tends to slip in. Quietly. It does not arrive as jealousy or bitterness. It appears as information. A glimpse of someone else's progress. A passing sense that others seem to move forward with less friction, as if they were given instructions you somehow missed. The thought moves on quickly, but it leaves a faint residue that alters how your own effort feels. Looking sideways is effortless. It asks nothing of you in the moment. The cost comes later, when attention drifts away from what is actually within reach. Energy that could have been invested in shaping your own circumstances is spent measuring yourself against lives you do not inhabit. Over time, this habit dulls initiative. Progress feels distant, even when it is quietly occurring. There is a harder comparison available, one that does not flatter and cannot be outsourced. It asks you to look backward instead of outward. Not to judge, but to notice. To see whether you are carrying yourself with slightly more steadiness than before. Whether hesitation has shortened. Whether recovery from mistakes takes less time. Whether you are a little more precise with your words, a little more reliable with your actions. Progress here rarely announces itself. It arrives as marginal gains that feel unremarkable in isolation. A reaction slowed just long enough to choose differently. A habit interrupted before it completes its usual loop. A responsibility accepted without negotiation. These moments are easy to dismiss because they lack drama. But they accumulate, quietly and decisively. The world tends to reward what is visible. Life is shaped by what is consistent. What you practice when no one is watching becomes what you rely on when pressure rises. Patterns rehearsed in private surface automatically when attention is strained. This is not a matter of motivation or identity. It is a matter of repetition. Discipline begins to form here, not as harshness, but as relief. Certain decisions no longer require daily debate because they have already been settled. Structure reduces friction. Energy is preserved for moments that genuinely require judgment instead of being spent renegotiating the same internal arguments. Meaning does not arrive as a sudden feeling. It arrives as alignment. As the sense that effort connects to something beyond immediate comfort. When responsibility is chosen deliberately, fatigue changes character. It feels earned rather than wasted. Even frustration loses some of its bitterness when it is linked to something you have decided matters. This does not make the day easier. It makes it clearer. Regret loses its sharp edge because fewer things were avoided outright. Satisfaction appears briefly, not as celebration, but as quiet acknowledgement that something necessary was handled when it needed to be. As the light shifts later in the day, attention naturally thins. The body grows heavier. The mind simplifies. This is when habits reveal their true strength. Not when motivation is high, but when you are tired and still choose the small action that keeps order from slipping entirely. Tomorrow will ask again. It always does. Not for transformation. Not for perfection. Just for the next honest adjustment, made without performance and without delay. As the day continues, language begins to exert its quiet influence. Not the careful words saved for serious moments, but the ordinary phrases used to explain what is happening and why. The way a situation is described does not merely reflect experience. It shapes it. What can be named precisely can be faced. What remains vague tends to spread. There is a familiar temptation to speak loosely when precision feels uncomfortable. To soften edges. To blur responsibility. To leave enough ambiguity that no one has to sit fully with what is being said. It feels considerate in the moment. Conversations remain smooth. Tension stays low. But every imprecise statement leaves something unfinished, and unfinished things rarely stay small. When language drifts away from experience, confusion grows quietly. You begin reacting to situations that are only partly real, built from assumptions repeated often enough to feel true. Over time, this misalignment creates a kind of low-level anxiety. Something feels wrong, but it is difficult to locate, because the words used to describe it have been dulled. Truth spoken carefully has a different effect. It aligns the inner world with the outer one just enough to allow movement. This alignment is not comfortable at first. It exposes contradiction. It draws attention to details that would be easier to ignore. But once those details are named, they stop working against you from the background. They occupy a place instead of everything. Small falsehoods ask to be protected. They require memory and adjustment. You must remember what was said, what must now be avoided, what cannot be admitted without unraveling something else. The effort is subtle but constant, like holding a door closed against pressure that never fully relents. Truth, by contrast, holds itself in place. It does not require maintenance. It simply remains. This does not mean saying everything. Precision requires restraint as much as courage. Listening becomes part of honesty, not as courtesy, but as calibration. You attend closely so your words reflect what is actually being said rather than what you fear or assume is meant. Attention keeps speech anchored to reality. Children sense this instinctively. They notice when explanations shift, when rules change without reason, when promises dissolve into softened language. Adults sense it too, though they often disguise their unease as tolerance. Trust erodes not because reality is harsh, but because it is described inconsistently. When speech becomes more accurate, commitments gain weight. A yes stops being provisional. A no stops being cruel. Boundaries become clearer because they are no longer hidden behind vague phrasing. Resentment has less room to grow when expectations are stated plainly instead of implied and then violated. Chaos thrives on ambiguity. It expands wherever clarity is avoided. Order pushes back through naming, through describing what is actually happening rather than what would be more comfortable to believe. Precision does not eliminate conflict. It contains it. As evening approaches, fragments of conversation replay themselves. Some feel complete, settled. Others carry a faint tension, a signal that something important was left unsaid or said too loosely. These signals are not punishments. They are information, pointing toward adjustments that can still be made. Tomorrow will offer another chance. Another conversation. Another opportunity to listen more carefully and speak with greater accuracy. Over time, this practice forms something durable. Not moral purity. Not perfection. But coherence. A sense that what you think, what you say, and what you do are beginning to share the same shape. Morning returns without checking whether you are ready. The body notices first. A stiffness that lingers longer than it used to. A heaviness behind the eyes that takes time to clear. A tension that drifts before it settles. These signals are easy to dismiss, especially when responsibility is already waiting. But they are not distractions. They are information, arriving early, before strain hardens into damage. There is a long habit of treating the self as something to be driven rather than maintained. As if endurance alone were evidence of strength. For a while, this works. Obligation supplies momentum. Pressure sharpens focus. You push through and things get done. But neglect compounds quietly. Irritation appears sooner. Patience thins. What once felt like discipline begins to sour into resentment, directed outward and inward at the same time. Caring for yourself as if you were responsible for someone dependent on you changes the tone of that inner relationship. It shifts the question from how much more can be extracted to what is required for steadiness to continue. Sleep becomes something to protect rather than postpone. Food becomes support rather than interruption. Rest is reframed, not as weakness, but as preparation. This kind of care is not indulgence. It is practical. Systems that are not maintained eventually fail, and failed systems demand far more attention than healthy ones ever did. Strength that cannot be sustained is not strength. It is a brief performance followed by collapse, and collapse carries its own costs. Environment plays its role here. What you tolerate around you gradually becomes what you tolerate within you. Disorder left unaddressed does not remain external. It seeps inward, shaping expectation. Noise becomes mental clutter. Chaos becomes normal. Tidying a space is rarely just about appearance. It is about signaling that attention still exists, that neglect has not fully taken over. Limits matter as well. Saying yes to everything is not generosity. It is confusion about capacity. Boundaries are not walls meant to keep others out. They are structures that protect what must function reliably. When limits are ignored, exhaustion eventually enforces them without negotiation, often at the worst possible moment. Throughout the day, these choices present themselves quietly. You pause before agreeing to something that would drain you unnecessarily. You prepare in advance instead of improvising under pressure. You repair what is beginning to fray while it is still manageable, rather than waiting for failure to make the decision for you. The world does not reward maintenance with applause. There is no recognition for problems that never fully materialize. But something shifts internally. Friction decreases. Fewer alarms are ringing at once. Effort travels farther because it is no longer leaking through neglect and fatigue. By evening, tiredness arrives again, but it feels different. Not sharp. Not hollow. The kind of fatigue that follows honest work supported by care. The body settles more easily. The mind loosens its grip because fewer things feel dangerously unfinished. Tomorrow will test this balance again. It always does. But tonight, there is a sense that the structure is holding. And when the structure holds, rest becomes possible without guilt or collapse. Conflict rarely announces itself at full volume. More often, it begins as a slight shift in tone. A pause where there used to be ease. A sentence left unfinished. A glance that lingers just long enough to register discomfort. These moments are easy to overlook, especially when life is busy. But they are early signals, and when ignored, they do not disappear. They reorganize. There is a widely held belief that peace is maintained through silence. That harmony depends on letting small things pass, on not turning discomfort into confrontation. Sometimes this is true. Not every irritation deserves attention. Not every disagreement needs to be pursued. But when silence becomes habit rather than choice, it changes character. It stops protecting relationships and begins eroding them from the inside. Unspoken grievances do not remain tied to their original causes. They resurface later as sarcasm, withdrawal, or sudden irritation that feels disproportionate to the moment. By then, the details have blurred. The initial issue is difficult to name. What remains is emotional charge without clear direction, ready to attach itself to whatever happens next. Addressing problems early requires a particular kind of courage. Not the courage to dominate or to win, but the courage to remain present while tension exists. To speak without exaggeration. To listen without rehearsing a defense. Most conflicts are not about facts alone. They are about fairness, dignity, and the fear of being dismissed or misunderstood. Fairness becomes the stabilizing principle here. Not fairness as an abstract ideal, but as a lived practice. Giving weight to the other person's experience without erasing your own. Allowing complexity rather than forcing a simple narrative of blame. This slows the exchange. It demands attention. But it prevents escalation that leaves lasting damage. Predictability matters more than agreement. When people know what to expect, they relax. When standards shift depending on mood, convenience, or power, trust erodes quickly. Fairness applied consistently creates ground that does not move unexpectedly beneath anyone's feet. Boundaries are part of this fairness. Saying no early and clearly causes far less harm than allowing resentment to accumulate until refusal arrives as an explosion. A boundary stated calmly does not humiliate. It informs. It gives the other person a chance to adjust rather than react. There is responsibility on the other side of the mirror as well. Recognizing your own role in conflict is uncomfortable. It disrupts the story where fault rests entirely elsewhere. But responsibility narrows the problem. It turns vague guilt into something specific that can be addressed. Clarity replaces confusion, and with it comes relief. Over time, relationships shaped by fairness develop resilience. Disagreements still occur. Emotions still flare. But repair remains possible because the underlying structure has not been weakened by avoidance or inconsistency. People know that speaking up will not be punished simply for being inconvenient. As the day winds down, unresolved moments return to awareness. Some feel lighter for having been addressed. Others remain open, but now they are visible rather than hidden. That visibility matters. Problems acknowledged tend to shrink. Problems avoided tend to spread. Fairness, practiced consistently, becomes another form of order. It steadies interaction. It reduces unnecessary drama. It preserves trust without demanding perfection. And in that steadiness, relationships become places where tension can exist without destroying connection. Disappointment rarely arrives with a clear beginning. It seeps in gradually, often disguised as realism. Expectations soften. Effort feels heavier. A path that once felt promising narrows without explanation. Nothing dramatic happens, and yet something essential feels misaligned, as though the future you were leaning toward has shifted just enough to make balance harder to maintain. Resentment waits nearby in these moments. It offers itself as interpretation. It explains disappointment as injustice, patience as foolishness, effort as exploitation. At first, this explanation feels stabilizing. It gives shape to frustration. It provides a reason for the heaviness that has arrived without warning. Stories do that. They make discomfort feel organized. But resentment does not stop at explanation. It begins to organize perception itself. Attention narrows. Evidence is gathered selectively. Neutral events tilt negative. Small inconveniences feel intentional. The world starts to look hostile, not because it has changed, but because the lens has. This lens extracts a cost. It drains energy without offering direction. Blame immobilizes. It positions you as a witness to your own life rather than an active participant. Movement slows, not because nothing can be done, but because responsibility has been handed over to circumstance. There is another response available, though it is quieter and less immediately satisfying. It asks a different question. Not who caused this, but what still belongs to you. What remains within reach, even now, even after disappointment has settled in. This question does not deny injustice. It simply refuses to let injustice determine everything that follows. Responsibility, even when limited, restores motion. The moment you identify a small area where action is still possible, direction returns. The future opens slightly. Not generously. Just enough to take the next step. Momentum does not require certainty. It requires traction. This does not mean accepting harm as deserved or pretending betrayal did not occur. Some losses cut deeply. Some failures close doors permanently. But carrying resentment forward does not repair what was damaged. It only ensures that the damage continues to demand attention long after the original event has passed. Meaning begins to take shape here, not as comfort, but as orientation. Suffering connected to chosen responsibility feels different from suffering framed as proof of victimhood. The pain remains real, but it no longer spreads everywhere. It becomes bounded, contained within a context that allows endurance instead of collapse. People who find meaning do not escape hardship. They simply refuse to let it become the sole organizing principle of their lives. They take what remains workable and begin again without announcement. Not because they are optimistic, but because stagnation has proven more destructive than effort. As evening approaches, familiar grievances surface again. Some still sting sharply. Others feel dulled, as if repetition has worn down their edges. This dulling is not denial. It is integration. The experience has been absorbed into a broader understanding of what life demands, and the demand no longer feels surprising. Tomorrow will present obstacles again. Some new, some unchanged. But resentment no longer determines the route. Responsibility, taken up carefully and repeatedly, begins to point forward. The path is not easy. It is simply visible again. The world does not apologize for its complexity. It does not simplify itself to spare disappointment. But within that complexity remains a choice. How much of what cannot be changed will be allowed to decide what comes next? Attention shifts almost without announcement toward the quiet influence of repetition. Not the kind that draws notice or praise, but the kind that shapes days from the inside. The way mornings are entered before thought fully wakes. The way evenings are closed when energy thins. These patterns feel insignificant while they are happening. Over time, they become decisive. There is a difference between aiming at what feels good now and aiming at what holds meaning over time. Immediate pleasure responds quickly. It reassures. It distracts. Meaning unfolds slowly and rarely offers confirmation along the way. When these are confused, life becomes crowded without becoming grounded. Days fill with activity, but direction thins. Meaning does not announce itself as certainty. It gathers around responsibility that has been chosen rather than imposed. Around work that asks for effort without promising applause. Around commitments that require something real and return something durable. When life is oriented this way, suffering does not disappear, but it changes tone. It feels less like punishment and more like cost willingly paid. This orientation always involves sacrifice, whether acknowledged or not. Every decision closes doors. Time invested here cannot be spent elsewhere. Energy committed in one direction cannot be preserved indefinitely. Resentment grows when these sacrifices are made unconsciously, when something valuable is given up without understanding why. The loss is felt, but its purpose is unclear. Conscious sacrifice feels different. It carries intention. You know what is being relinquished and what is being protected. The cost still exists, but it no longer feels arbitrary. It becomes part of an exchange rather than an erasure. Something is given up so that something else can be sustained. The world makes drifting easy. Screens glow. Notifications interrupt. Hours slip away without resistance. Drift is not a personal failure. It is the default state of unstructured attention. Order must be applied deliberately, or chaos fills the space automatically, without asking whether the result will be satisfying. Structure, when chosen carefully, does not confine. It frees. It reduces friction. It preserves energy for decisions that actually matter. Routines stop feeling like cages and begin to feel like channels, guiding effort forward instead of forcing it to restart each day from nothing. Somewhere in the day, often unnoticed, a choice is made to engage with what is meaningful instead of what is merely urgent. A difficult task is begun early rather than postponed into crisis. A conversation is addressed before silence hardens. A habit is interrupted while it is still small enough to change. These moments rarely feel heroic. They feel inconvenient. They disrupt comfort. But they leave behind a quiet sense of alignment, a recognition that the day moved in the right direction even if it was not easy. This recognition does not shout. It settles. As night returns, fatigue arrives again, but it is accompanied by clarity rather than agitation. The internal argument quiets. The mind releases its grip because the essential work of the day was not avoided entirely. Rest becomes possible without the undertow of regret. Meaning, approached indirectly through responsibility and conscious sacrifice, reveals itself not as an emotion but as a condition. A state where effort feels justified and suffering feels bounded. In that state, life becomes more bearable, not because it is lighter, but because it is oriented. Tomorrow will ask for the same choices in different forms. Orientation must be renewed. There are no final victories here. Only patterns sustained long enough to become a life. There are moments when speaking feels riskier than remaining silent. Not because the words are unclear, but because saying them might disturb a balance that has been maintained through avoidance. Silence can feel protective. It keeps surfaces smooth. It delays consequence. But over time, silence begins to shape the environment just as powerfully as speech ever could. What is left unspoken does not disappear. It settles into posture, tone, and distance. It shows up as tension in rooms where nothing overtly wrong seems to be happening. As conversations that remain polite but never quite reach depth. Silence, when used to avoid truth, becomes another form of disorder. Quieter, but no less corrosive. Listening sits beneath honest speech as a discipline rather than a courtesy. Not waiting for a pause so you can respond, but staying present long enough to understand what is actually being said. Most misunderstandings are not failures of intelligence. They are failures of attention. People speak from experiences that are often disorganized, emotionally charged, and difficult to articulate. Patience gives those experiences room to take shape. When someone feels genuinely heard, something shifts. The body relaxes. Defenses soften. The pace of the exchange slows. The conversation becomes less about protecting territory and more about orienting toward a shared problem. Agreement may still be distant, but hostility loses its grip when attention replaces assumption. Speaking truthfully requires restraint as much as courage. Exaggeration feels powerful in the moment. It sharpens emotion and draws clear lines. But it also distorts reality, enlarging the problem beyond what can be addressed. Precision keeps proportion intact. It allows the issue to remain specific rather than spreading into everything. Over time, careful speech builds trust. Not because every statement is flawless, but because intent becomes legible. Others learn that when you speak, you are attempting to describe what you see rather than manipulate what happens next. This predictability is rare, and it stabilizes relationships even under strain. The day offers constant practice. In small disagreements that could escalate. In explanations that could become excuses but are left intact. In refusals delivered calmly instead of postponed until frustration erupts. Each instance reinforces a pattern, quietly strengthening it. Discomfort often accompanies this shift. The body reacts when familiar avoidance is interrupted. That reaction is not danger. It is adjustment. A system learning a new way to remain stable under pressure without retreating into silence or aggression. As evening approaches, conversations replay themselves again, but with less distortion. There is less mental rehearsal, fewer imagined revisions. Not because everything was handled perfectly, but because what was said aligned closely enough with what was meant. The gap between intention and expression narrows. Truth spoken carefully does not simplify life. It keeps it navigable. It prevents small fractures from spreading unnoticed. It allows relationships to carry weight without breaking beneath it. Silence still has its place, but it becomes a choice rather than a refuge. Tomorrow will offer new opportunities to hide behind vagueness or distortion. It will also offer chances to speak in ways that preserve clarity and connection. The choice remains quiet, repeated often, and shaped slowly into habit. There comes a point when effort alone stops producing the results it once did. The signs appear gradually. Attention drifts sooner than expected. Small interruptions provoke irritation that feels out of proportion. Tasks that once carried meaning now feel heavy, not because their value has vanished, but because the system carrying them has been strained too long without relief. Rest is often misunderstood here. It is treated as a reward for exhaustion or as an indulgence that must be justified. But rest is not the opposite of responsibility. It is one of its conditions. Without renewal, effort becomes reactive. You begin responding only to what is loudest or most urgent, rather than what is most important. The day starts driving you instead of the other way around. There is a kind of pause that restores rather than distracts. It is chosen deliberately, not to escape life, but to return to it with clarity. A walk taken without an agenda. A meal eaten without rushing. A stretch of time where nothing is optimized or consumed. These moments rarely announce their value while they are happening. Their effect is felt later, in steadier focus and a quieter interior. Play belongs here, not as indulgence, but as recalibration. It reminds the nervous system that existence is not solely a sequence of problems waiting to be solved. When this reminder disappears entirely, resilience erodes. Everything begins to feel like demand. Joy, when it appears, feels thin and fleeting because there is no space for it to settle. Pleasure pursued without structure loses its restorative power. It becomes another form of avoidance, another way to delay discomfort rather than address it. The distinction is subtle and must be learned through experience. One leaves you clearer afterward. The other leaves you restless, searching for more. The difference is felt in the aftermath, not the moment itself. The day offers small chances to notice this difference. A moment of silence that settles rather than agitates. An activity that leaves you quietly energized instead of depleted. An evening closed without numbing distraction. These choices feel minor while they are being made. Over time, they shape endurance. Responsibility expands again here, paradoxically, to include joy. Not entitlement, but maintenance. A life stripped entirely of renewal becomes brittle. It cannot adapt when plans fail or losses arrive. Strength depends on elasticity as much as discipline. Without both, effort fractures. As night settles in, fatigue returns, but it carries a different quality. Not depletion. Not agitation. The feeling of being spent honestly rather than drained carelessly. Sleep arrives more easily because the system has not been pushed beyond its limits. Tomorrow will ask again for responsibility and attention. It will also offer opportunities for renewal if they are noticed and accepted without guilt. Balance will never be exact. But awareness allows adjustment before collapse. The rhythm continues quietly. Engagement and rest. Structure and release. Held together carefully enough to make endurance possible. Not everything that enters your attention deserves to stay there. Ideas arrive constantly, some loud and certain, others gentle and reassuring. They present themselves as explanations, identities, answers. Over time, they do not remain abstract. They shape how you interpret events, how you assign blame, how you justify what you tolerate and what you reject. Certain beliefs are especially appealing because they promise clarity. They divide the world neatly. They tell you who is right, who is wrong, and why your anger or confusion makes sense. In moments of uncertainty or pain, this kind of certainty feels like relief. It offers a map when orientation is lost. It gives you a place to stand and a direction to point. But clarity that arrives too quickly often conceals a cost. When a belief demands certainty at the expense of nuance, perception begins to narrow. Experience is filtered. Contradictions are dismissed. Evidence that does not fit is ignored or reshaped until it does. What began as understanding slowly hardens into constraint, limiting what you are able to see and consider. Responsibility returns here as intellectual humility. The willingness to admit that your view is partial. That reality resists being fully captured by any single framework. This humility is not indecision. It is protection against rigidity, against the quiet arrogance that blinds you to error and isolates you from correction. Listening becomes more valuable than declaring. Not passive listening, but attentive engagement that tests ideas against lived experience. When a belief requires you to deny what you repeatedly see, what you consistently feel, or what reliably happens around you, something essential has been sacrificed for the comfort of certainty. Human complexity does not tolerate simplification for long. Any system that denies it eventually relies on force to maintain itself. At first, that force is internal. Doubt is suppressed. Questions are treated as disloyalty. Over time, the pressure moves outward. Others become problems rather than people. Conversation turns brittle. Curiosity fades. Clarity emerges not from eliminating contradiction, but from tolerating it long enough to learn. From being able to say that something is not simple and does not need immediate resolution. This stance keeps perception flexible. It allows understanding to evolve instead of calcify. Throughout the day, this discernment is tested in ordinary ways. In conversations where slogans replace thought. In arguments where volume substitutes for understanding. In moments when agreement is offered as the price of belonging. The pressure is subtle, but persistent. Resisting it does not require confrontation. It requires steadiness. You remain oriented toward truth rather than approval. You preserve the ability to revise your views when experience demands it. You stay open to correction without surrendering coherence. By evening, mental noise softens. Fewer borrowed certainties are being carried. There is space again for reflection instead of reaction. The mind feels less crowded, more capable of holding complexity without urgency. Tomorrow will bring new ideas, new claims, new invitations to simplify what cannot be reduced without loss. Discernment will be required again. With practice, it becomes quieter, less exhausting. Not a battle, but a filter that keeps attention aligned with reality. Time has a way of revealing what intention alone cannot. Patterns repeat. Consequences return without accusation. Choices made casually months or years ago begin to show their shape in the present, not as punishment, but as structure. You recognize them without shock, with a quiet familiarity, as though something long in motion has finally come into view. Attention turns forward here, but not toward fantasy. Not toward idealized versions of how things might have been. It turns toward responsibility extended into the future. You begin to sense that the person you are becoming is already being shaped by what you repeat now. That future self no longer feels abstract. It feels close enough to matter, close enough to be protected or disappointed by what happens today. Neglect compounds efficiently. Health ignored declines without warning. Relationships unattended drift into distance without protest. Skills unused dull gradually until they are needed and found unreliable. None of this feels urgent while it is happening. That is what makes it dangerous. Damage accumulates quietly, below the threshold of alarm. Care compounds just as quietly. Small investments made early create options later. Preparation builds resilience. When difficulty arrives, as it always does, it lands on a structure capable of absorbing strain rather than collapsing under it. The difference between endurance and breakdown is rarely one dramatic decision. It is the result of many small ones made consistently. This forward responsibility does not demand obsession. It requires honesty about direction. If nothing changes, where does this lead? If one small adjustment is made now, what becomes possible later? These questions do not require perfect answers. They function as orientation, guiding effort away from drift and toward continuity. Mortality enters awareness here, not as threat, but as boundary. Time is finite. Energy is limited. Pretending otherwise leads to waste disguised as freedom. Accepting limitation sharpens attention. It clarifies what deserves care and what can be released without regret. Urgency softens, replaced by priority. Throughout the day, this awareness shapes choices almost invisibly. You choose steadiness over impulse. You decline what would erode the future for momentary relief. You invest effort where results will not be immediate, trusting accumulation rather than spectacle. These decisions feel sober rather than dramatic, protective rather than restrictive. A calm begins to form around this orientation. Less need to prove. Less pressure to rush. The present moment becomes more inhabitable because it is no longer severed from what follows. Action feels connected to consequence in a way that steadies rather than overwhelms. Evening brings reflection again, but now it stretches forward as well as back. Not into imagination, but into responsibility. The question is no longer only what happened today, but what kind of tomorrow is being quietly prepared through repetition, through habit, through the unnoticed choices that shape direction. The answer is never final. It shifts with circumstance and understanding. But the act of asking keeps the path visible, even when it curves beyond sight. It prevents life from becoming something that simply happens without participation. Tomorrow will ask again. It always does. But you meet it differently now, aware that what you carry forward is being shaped whether you attend to it or not. Attention does not guarantee success. It offers something more realistic. It gives the future a chance to be met deliberately rather than as a surprise. Toward the end, what remains is not a set of conclusions or a finished system, but a posture toward life as it actually unfolds. Incomplete. Demanding. Capable of moments of beauty that arrive without warning and suffering that stays longer than expected. The hope of eliminating chaos fades here, not in disappointment, but in clarity. Chaos was never something to be conquered. It was something to be faced. What takes shape instead is a form of voluntary engagement. You accept weight not because it is pleasant, but because avoiding it has proven more destructive. You take responsibility not as a display of virtue, but as a stabilizing force. Something that keeps the ground beneath you from shifting too violently when life inevitably applies pressure. There is humility in this stance. Expectations soften. You stop insisting that the world organize itself around your preferences. You stop treating disappointment as evidence of betrayal. Reality is met where it stands, without dramatization. When the ground is uneven, you adjust your footing rather than demanding that it change. Suffering does not disappear in this posture, but it changes shape. Pain carried in connection to chosen responsibility feels different from pain framed as senseless or imposed. It remains difficult, but it no longer spreads indiscriminately. It stays contained, bounded by purpose rather than leaking into resentment, bitterness, or despair. Life does not become gentle through this understanding. It becomes navigable. Problems still arise. Loss still arrives without permission. Effort still fails at times. But the internal structure is stronger now. You are less likely to be thrown completely off balance by what cannot be controlled. By now, the patterns are familiar, even if they are never fully mastered. Posture before confidence. Truth before clarity. Care before endurance. Fairness before peace. Responsibility before meaning. Attention before change. These are not ideals to admire from a distance. They are practices tested daily in ordinary moments, often when no one is watching and nothing feels especially significant. The house grows quiet again. Lights are turned off one by one. The day closes without ceremony, as it always does. Somewhere, something was handled slightly better than before. Somewhere else, a mistake waits patiently to be addressed tomorrow. This is not failure. It is continuity. Life carried forward without collapse. You rest knowing that order was not perfected, only sustained long enough to make rest possible. That is enough. Tomorrow will ask again, and the response will not be a theory or a speech. It will be a posture held under pressure. A word chosen carefully. A responsibility accepted without drama. Life does not require you to be extraordinary. It does not demand constant confidence or certainty. It asks something quieter and more difficult. That you remain present. That you speak as truthfully as you can manage. That you carry what is yours rather than pretending it does not exist. In that willingness, practiced steadily over time, something durable forms. Not guaranteed happiness. Not permanent order. But meaning earned slowly through attention and responsibility, and chaos held back just enough, long enough, for a life to be lived.